Good evening. My name is John Nizer, and I'm the president of Friends of Y Mill. We own and operate the old Y Mill in Y Mills, Maryland. On behalf of the Friends of Y Mill, thank you for joining us for part one of our five-part speaker series. We hope that you enjoy the feature tonight and invite your friends for next Thursday night for part two of our five-part series featuring Sherry Marsh Johns. Also, we invite you to join us at the Old Y Mill opening day ceremony on Saturday, the 1st of May, from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. For further information on that, please go to our website, www.oymill.org. I want to do a big thank you to our staff and everybody who worked so hard to get this up and running, especially our project director, Barry Kessler. We had a little bit of video problems tonight. Let's blame it on the coronavirus. Before we start part one, the British Empire strikes, I want to take a minute to dedicate this speaker series to honor the memory of Mr. James Casey Sr. Jim passed away suddenly on Monday morning, April the 5th. Jim was a longtime member of the Friends of Y Mill. He dedicated 40 years of volunteer time, 40 plus years, I should say, of volunteer time. He was an experienced miller at the Old Y Mill. Thank you, Jim, for the many years of dedicated service to the Friends of Y Mill. My friend, you will be missed by everyone associated with the mill. God bless you and your family. And now I'd like to introduce our project director, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Barry Kessler.
Thank you, John, and welcome to all of our participants. I'm really looking forward to this evening as we kick off our first virtual programming for Old Y Mill. Before we go any further, I must acknowledge the support of our sponsor, because this program is made possible by a grant from the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority with Maryland state funds through the Stories of the Chesapeake Heritage Area. This generous funding has enabled Old Y Mill to put in place and now implement comprehensive, revitalized visitor engagement at our historic site. So this series of programs, which is part of the project with Maryland Heritage Areas Authority, or funded by them, is designed to give our community, in the broadest possible way, an understanding of the context of Old Y Mill, historical, economic, racial, geographic, and technological context. And tonight our speaker will begin this process by showing us how the Eastern Shore of Maryland emerged from its colonial roots in the 1600s and 1700s and developed the distinctive social and economic structure of the Tidewater. So it is my real pleasure to introduce Nevin Crouse, professor of humanities at Chesapeake College, which is our neighbor, located just down the road from Y Mill. Nevin is the grandson and great-grandson of millers himself. His family ran the Crouse Mill in Middleburg, Maryland for almost 100 years. He grew up in Easton, Maryland and in Pennsylvania, and has taught history and other humanities subjects at Chesapeake College for more than 20 years. He currently serves on the college council and as chair of the faculty. Let me mention that at the end of our program, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. Anastasia Rokiski, our Zoom host, will help us out with that process. And then for those people who are considering or who are already volunteers, I ask you to stay on at the end of the program, and we'll have a brief discussion or debriefing. So thank you very much, Nevin. We're ready to begin.
Well, thank you. Hi there. So tonight, there's our topic. Colonization, mercantilism, and the creation of the Tidewater. And you may wonder, well, what in the heck does that have to do with Old Y Mill? And hopefully, toward the end of this, you'll know exactly what all that has to do with it. So let's start with European countries in the 15 and 1600s in a desperate race. They had this view of the world that there was only so much wealth, and that if somebody else got some, that meant that you had less. And they didn't have much of a grasp on economics at all. And so it was a mad dash, having become aware, I don't say discovered, but become aware of other places on the earth to dominate those places. And in an effort to keep them, they would try to claim them by settling them with people from their own civilization. And so that's what was going on by the 1500s when the British started to try to colonize. And so how that colonization worked is this. Now you can see why North America was such a destination to try to acquire and keep lands, because it was easy to get to and you could get back. Those are the currents of the North Atlantic. All right. Out here, this particular part is called the Gulf Stream. All right. So that's why people were going where they were going from Europe. So the crowns would give people lands, and nobody knew where the exact boundaries were. So we had Swedes, Dutch, Spanish, British, and French all wanting the same area. Now, as you know, Jamestown was founded in 1607. And for a long time, people didn't know exactly where that was, because the colony didn't die out, but it gradually moved over to Williamsburg. Maybe you wondered why there's all that historical reenactment and interpretation in Williamsburg and not in Jamestown. Well, we lost track of Jamestown. And so round about the just a few years ago, when it was the 500th anniversary of the settling of the colony, they went and found it. It's easier on this map. You see Jamestown here? Okay. Now, a very interesting thing explaining what all was going on between the empires and what the empires were up to happened to be better understood when they went looking for Jamestown, because they thought they found it and then realized, because of the construction and the size and various things about the fort that they found, that it couldn't possibly be the original Jamestown. So what it was the original Spanish fort. This may be news to you, that the Chesapeake region was originally Spanish and claimed by Spain. Well, but it was. Similarly, other areas, other parts of our area were also claimed by others who attempted to settle them and plant forts. The Spanish fort is down here near the mouth. And then there was actually a mission planted, but the mission was wiped out by the indigenous tribes, and the fort was destroyed by the English, who then burned it down and disposed of the bodies of the Spanish and just acted like it never happened. So that's imperial warfare right here in River City. Exactly here, you have Greensboro, and as the sign says, the hub of the universe, Goldsboro. It might surprise you to know that that region was originally Swedish, all up in here, and then a little bit across the river in New Jersey, what is now New Jersey. It was Swedish over here, and then Dutch, and then the English took it from the Dutch in 1667. So the name of the game then was to attract settlement to claim territory. All right. The Dutch concentrated in this region. Now, this is a Dutch map. It says New Belgium here, and don't let that throw you. The Belgians and the Dutch were trying to unify at the time and both kick out the Spanish. So here's the Chesapeake Bay, and that was the southern regions of what the Dutch were claiming. And then here's the Delaware Bay, and there's, of course, Long Island, and here's Cape Cod. So this whole region, now how the Dutch handled their settlement, and the reason we're talking about them is they tried to set up minor nobility or well-to-do gentry. And that's what all these noted, more thickly marked rivers are. The deal they would make you is if you would bring 42 settlers, and I've never had anybody explain to me why it was 42, but if you bring 42 settlers and their equipment to farm, then the Dutch Empire would give you 17 miles of river coast. Could be some on one side of the river, some on the other side of the river, and their land grants went as far as you cared to go. And this is why some of these states later claimed territory from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, because that was the original land grant. That would be some kind of serious state, I think. But that's how they did it. The French set up a similar deal where they called people little lords, seigneurs. The English did a thing called head rights. And it's the same basic idea. You get to be gentry, possibly considering yourself minor nobility. If you will come, those free people that come get land. And you also get land for anybody that you pay to bring who survives for a little while. I don't know what the little while was, but they had to survive the trip and start working here. So this meant indenture, because most of the people who would come couldn't pay for it. And so more well-to-do people would pay their passage, and then they would be contracted to perform a certain amount and certain kinds of labor for a certain period of time. All right. So who would do such a thing, you may ask? And the answer is prisoners. There were a lot of people in debt, in prison for debt, and in prison for petty crimes. And you didn't want to stay in prison for petty crimes because what the British Empire was doing at the time was executing people for just about everything. They eventually stopped doing that because they noticed that when they executed the people who had stolen bread to not starve, including little children, and pickpockets and prostitutes, which were how male and female poor people in the cities tried to live when there was no job. There were so many people bringing picnics to the executions that they figured out it wasn't a deterrent. People just got used to watching people die, and they made it as gruesome as possible. Let me see. No, I'm sorry, I forgot the mounted picture. Ah! Well, what they would do is tie people uh, onto a small crane that loaded and unloaded boats. And they'd put a noose around them attached to the crane, called a yard arm for the small ones, and put you on a barge or a small boat. And then as the tide went out, you would slowly strangle to death. This is various places in London on the Thames. So that wasn't gruesome enough to prevent prostitutes and pickpockets from working the crowd at the public execution, which is why they tried looking for other things to do with people, and they would sell them as indentures. Oh. So the pull then was for land. Everybody wanted land and some new opportunity. Now, at the same time, while all this was going on, from 1642 to 1659, there was warfare in England over religion and over the form of government, whether they would remain royal or become a commonwealth controlled by somebody appointed by Parliament. And people wanted to get out of that war. And so the way to get out of the war was to come to the colonies. Some people could do it on their own, and then of course others would want to be indentured. So to avoid being cannon fodder, to get some land and to make some money, people got out, either came themselves or brought indentures. So an indenture got transportation, food, clothing, housing, and the tools of their work was the traditional deal. There was a food hierarchy. So the best food goes to the gentry, of course. And then there's a very few artisans that work for them, and they get pretty good food. And then there's servants and slaves. Now, for a lot of the history, I think especially before the American Revolution, indentured servants and slaves were not treated very differently or housed very differently or clothed very differently. We know that from records of plantations and other work where they kept record of what they gave the various folks. In the South, I guess to make things sound a little better, they called everybody a servant. But then here are your supplies for the year. As in food, you would get low quality corn, often moldy, bad cuts of pork and beef, pickled herring, flour that was famous for having hatched weevils and various bugs in it. And let's see, extremely poor quality everything. And so that's what was given for servants and slaves. The clothing for 1 year was one jacket, one pair of breeches, one shirt, two stockings, two shoes, one hat and one blanket, and half of enough ticking to make a bed. I don't know how people managed that, but they did. The housing, there's very little I can show you about the housing because it was of such poor quality that most of it's destroyed or fallen to pieces. It's hard to tell what it was like, except later in the presentation, I'll show you some slave quarters that were also used for indenture when they had those. In Louisiana, because they were built of cypress. And so that wood has not deteriorated. So even though they were low quality buildings, some of them are still there. but not much in the Chesapeake region, and nothing I could find for sure from the Chesapeake region to show you. The closest I found was West Virginia. So I didn't think that would help us much. So this is an exchange for whatever years of labor you could negotiate. And so here's how most people got here. I should say that indenture was everything at first, and then it gradually decreased, but didn't entirely die out until the 1930s for various reasons. Now, with an indenture, you were not bound to a lifetime of servitude. There was a contract, well, theoretically, not a lifetime of servitude. Your children didn't inherit the status, and you had rights under your contract. And so here is a contract from the late 1600s. And I'm sorry it's not very readable. You can see the word indenture up here, but this is standard language. But then note that all indentured contracts are not the same. It was whatever deal you could make. This is, by the way, a Maryland indenture contract, like was done in the 1680s and 90s. See all the places for personalization and where specifics are written in? So that's how indenture worked. There's a basic principle, and then the time period and the specifics of every variable in the deal were dependent on your skills, who you were working for, and basically they would give you as little as possible to get you to sign, and then they had you. Now, the reason for that, the reason that then they had you, is because the contract is a false hope. Before 1700, most indentures did not live long enough to be freed. So in many, many, many cases, indenture was lifetime servitude. Also, your contract could be lengthened for misbehavior. And misbehavior was judged by your owner, and that's the term they used, the person who owned your indenture. And interestingly enough, the judge was either the big landowner in the area or one of his friends. So it was not unknown to have a woman, a servant unmarried, become pregnant by her so-called owner, who would then take her to court and demand that her servitude be lengthened because she was found improperly with child. Yeah, it could be that bad. So that's where a very high percentage of the population of the Chesapeake region came from. It is indentured servants. Wow. I don't know about you, but I need a moment to deal with that. So the rich are coming for land, the hope of income from working the land, status from being a major landowner, power, and perhaps to get out of the religious struggles. And then the indentures are coming for hope for all of the above, which was not usually realized. So let's fast forward to when the Ark and the Dove arrived in 1634, and there was confusion. Now, as you look at this map, you see New Netherlands here, and there in the at that time period in the 1630s and then in the 40s, this was New Sweden. Now, the lines in there now are our current states, but I hope we all know that the lines there are the Mason-Dixon surveyed lines, and they weren't there at this time. So as I said, nobody knew exactly where the lines were. And when the Ark and the Dove came, look at what Virginia was claiming. But then the king had also granted the Calverts Maryland. And so when the Ark and the Dove arrived, there were 34 rich people, 17 well-to-do couples, and about 200 indentures. And the reason we don't know the exact number is nobody cared, and the records weren't very good. They didn't count, they were just indentures. So that's the first group. The issue very quickly became, though, that in what was now being seen as Maryland territory, Kent Island, rather close to home for the mill, they could see that there was a Virginia plantation on Kent Island, and the Virginians were trading also for tobacco, not just raising it themselves, but also trading with the Indians in the area. And so there are these Virginia people in Maryland territory, and it's a different grant and different terms. And you can study all about the Claibornes and their various problems at a later date. There were actually tiny little shooting wars between Maryland and Virginia over all that. So the rich and the poor all wanted the same thing: hope, money, land. And at first, it's indentures and gentry. And then slaves are going to be gradually added, and I'll show you that in just a minute. So why couldn't people get what they wanted out of this system? And the answer is mercantilism. So mercantilism is a really interesting kind of a thing. How it works is that the empire, in this case the British, tell the colonies that they could only produce primary products. Primary products are the things you make other things out of. Okay, like if it's cereal, it's the sugar and grain, and a few chemicals. Sorry. And so if you can only produce primary products, you're never going to make much money because nobody wants to pay for primary products. Right now, between 5 and 6 cents of every box of cereal goes to the farmers for the produce. The rest of the money you pay is various amounts of profit, packaging, advertising, secondary production, and all that. So it's not the food, it's the processing and then the marketing and all that. So you're not going to make money. Nobody wants to pay for primary products. We have the same problem on the shore. Right now, farmers are not making much more per acre, per bushel of corn here on the shore than they were in the 1960s. Now, yields have gone up. A real good yield has gone from 100 bushels an acre to over 200 bushels an acre. But how much you want to bet expenses have gone up more than double since the 1960s. So you see the problem of primary production that our region and every primary producing region has. And so there's another side to this that's even more evil. Colonies could only produce primary products, but then they had to sell them to whoever the empire said they could sell them to. And for a while, the empire said that the British colonists could sell their products to the Dutch, but then they took that away and went to the war with the Dutch and took the Dutch colonies. But what happens if you're a producer and you must sell to only one group? Well, then you can't take the highest bid. You can't shop your product around. You're going to receive the minimum for your labor. But it's even more evil than that. Then the colonies weren't allowed to produce much of anything. And so they had to buy it from whoever the empire said. Now, how much are you going to pay if you must buy from only particular merchants and there's no competition? Oh, so the sweat equity of everybody of every class in the British North American colonies, and also the Dutch and the French and the Spanish and everybody else, went to the merchants and the politicians of the mother country. And so everybody else was on edge. Even the gentry were often nervous because their margins were very, very thin, and they would be afraid of losing their lands and their mansions and their everything. And now you know why. So it's mercantilism that is the problem. We're used to thinking of it as just quaint, but the Navigation Acts, originally secret orders in the British Council, were finally came out in the open and were passed as a series of laws in the 1660s by the Parliament. And it set up 2 legal ports in each of the colonies on the east coast of North America. And so that's where this quaint, the original of this quaint building came from. The 2 ports in Maryland were Oxford and Annapolis. After the law was, the rules were finally promulgated. And those are the ports that ended up being the official ports. And so all shipping coming and going had to go through those ports and be inspected and taxed. And so the customs officer would make sure that the mercantilistic rules were being obeyed. And anybody going in and out of any other port with shipping was a smuggler and was guilty. And so what did the British do about that? Well, develop the largest navy in the history of the world to police this mercantilist system. This ship is the Prince Royal that was launched in 1610 and was finally burned by the Dutch in that little war I was telling you about in 1663. Here is a painting of its surrender from the time period. It ran aground, and so they had to surrender or they were just going to be blown to bits. So it's the British, that's why the British Navy, and that's why everybody was upset with the empire after a while in British North America. Just thought you'd want to know. Yeah. So what then was produced in our area? Well, you know, at first it was tobacco. Tobacco is a miraculous plant, makes all kinds of chemicals. The original tobacco of that time, before John Rolfe hybridized it to be milder, was actually hallucinogenic, but nobody knows if that was because of the chemicals or the thickness of the smoke denying oxygen to the brain. But the records from the time all say the same thing, that tobacco was hallucinogenic. So we grew tobacco, but it took so many minerals out of the soil that people then went to wheat. Oh, and these are the big barrels of tobacco between 2 canoes being taken to market. And we know all about the wheat production, right? So the wheat kernels, the wheat berries were shipped, but also the ground flour, and our flour was of particularly high quality. So it's tobacco, wheat, flour, timber, especially around Cambridge and Vienna. This is the Nanticoke River near Vienna, halfway between Cambridge and Salisbury. Now I'm bringing that up because 2 of the major ports for logging, the transportation of high quality timber, and then ship production was permitted there in Vienna and Cambridge, and this is why. Those trees made excellent masts and spars. That's white pine in a swampy setting, and that's what we had. So we had tobacco, wheat, lumber, timber, and then slaves. We became a production area for slaves. And this is a, what was it called, a stereopticon in its early days. These pictures are from 1861. And these were, the caption was "Children for Sale." And so those were our primary products in this region. And so that brings us to slavery. People who were enslaved in Maryland, good records were not kept until the census of 1790, but the first enslaved folk arrived in the colony of Maryland in 1642, and there were 13 of them. That's just what, 24 years after the first slave ship arriving in Virginia. By 1660, there were 950 estimated slaves in Maryland. By 1700, it's 13,000. Now keep a hold of that, 13,000 slaves. Total population of the colony was 25,000. Oh, so you see, indenture kept going, but gradually decreased, and slavery gradually increased. By 1760, there were 49,000 slaves in Maryland. So what does this give us? Well, see, primary production. So there are landowners. So there is a gentry. And that's where you're going to go next time. There's a gentry that is rather desperate to keep their wealth and their status, but it's very difficult, and they often felt threatened with loss of all that. Then there are a few artisans who work for them, and then there is a huge strata of servants and slaves, or as some people put it, slaves for life, and slaves that were supposed to be freed after a period. So that means that our region had a really different demographic that continues to this day, where, especially in places like Talbot County, as late as my childhood, it was one of the richest counties in the country. So we have an unusually large layer of gentry. Then we had artisans who served the population, and in more modern times, that would be plumbers and carpenters and all like that. In an unhappy tension between the gentry and the artisans, the gentry were famous for not paying and getting away with it because they were the gentry. I remember growing up with people who worked for the gentry, and they were constantly late and underpaid, or just payment was skipped altogether. So apparently this has continued for coming up on 400 years with the tension in our society. So gentry, a few skilled laborers, a huge strata of worker bees, those given less opportunity. So these are Louisiana quarters of slaves from the early 1800s that have survived. I think the roofs are newer. nevertheless. Now, in the last couple minutes, now we know who the folks are and why they're here. So we have these huge class divisions with very little in the middle. How did we go from slaves, enslaved people, to more free labor? Although it's hard for me to think of Jim Crow as very free labor. This is the Friends Meeting House, the Third Haven Meeting House in Easton. Now, when everybody meets together, they go through this door into the main area. But occasionally, the men go through this door and the women go through this door to have separate meeting, because from very early in their history, the Quakers realized that there were gender dynamics and family politics in marriage relationships. And so sometimes when they needed to make a decision, they would make the decision discussing it separately. And you can still see that in the original meeting house, these partitions come down. And so the elder women would be sitting up here, and the elder men would be sitting up here, or whoever felt moved. And they would have their meeting separately. And then they'd raise the partitions and report to each other. Now, I told you that story to tell you this. Around about 1688, in one of these separate meetings outside of Philadelphia, some Quaker women said, we believe, sorry, I shouldn't have pushed that. We believe that every human being has the spark of divinity, the light of God in them. Therefore, it can't be right to enslave someone who is a vessel of God. And so then when the partitions went up and the two meetings, the men's meeting and the women's meeting, reported to each other about what they were discussing, the women brought this up and there was a big argument, but eventually the men folks said, you're right. And when they decided the women were right, it was the middle of winter. So three of the men, and a Lutheran pastor from nearby who had heard about the discussion, strapped on their snowshoes and ran or trudged into Philadelphia to tell the larger Quaker meetings, and that's where abolition comes from, as a large movement in the American tradition. And here we are, Party Central, for this now, for this event. So here's the question. Were our Quaker millers abolitionists? And if so, how were they involved in the Underground Railroad or the life of Frederick Douglass? And the answer is, I don't know. But I do know that some of our millers were Quakers, and that eventually most of the Quakers turned to abolition, although there was variety among the Quakers. And so what is the connection? Well, that's as far as I can get you. These are photographs of the last bags for cornmeal and flour from my great uncle and my grandfather's mill. Grandfather died in the 50s, and my great uncle Raymond Crouse ran the mill until the early 1980s. And so I just thought I'd end. Oh, and you can see over my shoulder, that's one of the last flour bags. So that's my interest in all this. And that's how the social stratification and the class system and plantation agriculture developed because of the imperial policy of holding land through settlement and then enforcing mercantilism. Um, what a long, strange trip it's been. Uh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nevin. That, I think, gave us all a lot to think about. At this point, I would like to open the floor to questions. If anyone would like to reflect on what we've just heard or to ask Professor Crouse some questions. My question for you is, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how the land, the division of land that began in the settlement era has continued or changed through the years. Do we still see some reflection of that in the way our Eastern Shore counties are divided up land-wise?
Yes, there are still original land grant families that own land, although over the years they've tended to sell some of it to pay the bills. And uh, plantation agriculture was a very difficult uh, way to be rich. Sometimes people could have a beautiful house and a huge property and nice clothes and be completely cash broke.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, if times got really hard, then the servants and slaves uh, ate even more poorly than they did usually. So we still have some of these land grants. We still have roads, uh, peninsula, uh, two of my favorites. Actually, does anybody else know Jennifer Goldsboro? She's a direct descendant of the original Goldsboroughs who were granted the land uh, by the king in this region. There's Goldsboro Road, Goldsboro Point, Goldsboro Street, those Goldsboroughs. And so they're still here. Um, of course, you'd never know that they had been nobility other than Jennifer and her husband are wonderful people. And she's taught art at Chesapeake College, and we've been colleagues for a while. Um, anyway, there's also Lecomte Point outside of Cambridge. And that was a French nobility. Comte, I think, translates to count in English. And they turned outlaw and were pirates, and they hid out around that point. They'd go out in the bay and then out in the Atlantic and mess with the British and mess with the Spanish, and then come back and hide out in the swamp here in the bay. So the original lands are sometimes still owned by the folks and sometimes just named after them.
I saw a hand up, and I'm not sure whose it was because it just said iPhone.
Hey, Barry, you're on mute.
Well, I see a question here in the chat. How did Eastern Shore Quakers fare once they freed their slaves? And there was variety, but the Quakers tended to do all right because being scattered through the hostility to their religious persuasion and lifestyle, they were scattered all over the earth. And so they became a trading network that tended to do quite well economically, because if they couldn't get it for you, they knew another Quaker somewhere who probably could, and they were in contact through shipping. Quakers got seriously into shipping. So quite a few did very, very, very well. But as far as what the percentages are, and of course, really poor to Midland Quakers wouldn't have many slaves or servants. So the answer is shipping. Oh, here's another one. Since it's important to learn from history, what lessons would you highlight for us as we navigate today's world? Well, you may want to burn me in effigy, or you may want to burn me and skip the effigy for saying this, but I think it is self-defeating, and it's shown in this time period, and it's shown now. It is self-defeating to keep so much of the profit from labor in the hands of those who own the land. Doesn't work. It will eventually lead to destruction. Pitchforks will come out. And so personally, I would think that would have something to do with the minimum wage, but I think I'll stop there. I guess I've just reminded myself of something else that happened that was kind of fascinating. I went to a party, and I never went back to that house ever again, and I doubt they would invite me, because I could not hide my displeasure, because all the guests were white, and all the serving staff was black in white outfits that accentuated their color. And these people were playing plantation aristocracy. And I was embarrassed to be there, and I got out as soon as politely possible, and I probably should have gotten out sooner. I spent a lot of time talking to the help. And well, anyway, it seems that some of this hasn't actually died.
Another question, Nevin, is in the chat, and I can read it for you. Please confirm or correct my impression that this English settlement system of gentry, craftsmen, servants, and slaves was in place on the western and southern shore as it was on the eastern. I'm assuming the question is about these shores of Maryland.
Yeah.
The eastern shore of Maryland, the western and southern. You referred to Port Tobacco. And was the system the same on both sides of the Chesapeake Bay?
Yeah, the system.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. The system was the same on both sides of the bay, and it was also the same in all the colonies. Mercantilism is mercantilism. It's just there wasn't much plantation agriculture because the land and the climate wouldn't support it very far north of us, although there was and is tobacco production all the way up into protected bottomlands in Massachusetts, outside of Amherst, where I've seen the tobacco fields myself. So it's less in other, as far as the plantation, and other places, then people just supported themselves through small farming and didn't make much for export. And except for, of course, if they had some extra corn, they'd turn it into whiskey, and you probably know that story. So the North got more into fishing and shipping and timber and just being able to support yourself, because that's what the climate would support. But the same mercantilism was run the same way, and everywhere the land would support plantation agriculture, it was done.
Thank you. Cynthia has a question. Do you want to go ahead, Cynthia?
Thank
Saunders?
you. Thank you. I'm up here in Kent County. I wanted to speak to up here in particular, there wasn't a whole lot of gentry. They definitely brought a lot of indentured people, but most of the people that we know about from early records came with family members. Later, there were more indentured servants, but there also were a number, I know of at least 5 ship captains, mariners, they're always called mariner, who came and who brought, in one case, 30 people with them, and that the same headright system was in place. And initially, if anybody lived through their indenture, that period, they would get 50 acres of land later, and a suit of clothes and so on and so forth, which was pretty standard. But later that piece was chopped out. You got the suit of clothes and the set of tools and, you know, probably a crust of bread to go off and set on your own. So, but there wasn't a very wealthy group around here to begin with. And there were also a number of apparently refugees from Scotland, from all of the unpleasantness going on in England, and who got here by way of Barbados. So there's really definitely a mix up here. We had a relatively large Quaker population up in the north part of the county, and Thomas Gilpin was a Quaker miller. He was the founder. It was Gilpinton originally. It became Millington. And he had a number of mills up there, and the grain that he actually was a member of the American Philosophical Society, and he invented a form of wheat that didn't rust. The flour didn't rust, and so they were shipping that to the West Indies directly out of Duck Creek up in that part of the Kent County and then into Delaware. So there's a lot. He also died in prison because he refused to fight in the Revolution. So there are lots of interesting stories all over the place.
Let me continue that one. So the wheat that doesn't rust, I'm unclear how it got here, but there was research done, and that was a particular strain of Mesopotamian wheat that was imported and then propagated throughout our region. And it didn't rust as much when shipped as grain, neither did it when milled into flour.
Right.
So during the War of 1812, what most people don't know is that the British Navy came up into the bay originally to destroy the mills and stop us from supplying the French, because the French were buying our flour specifically from the breadbasket, which was us at the time, because the Brits with the Great Navy were trying to do a trade embargo on the French, and we demanded the right to trade with both. And so the British attacked us. Well, they went for the mills, but they couldn't get them. They tried to sail up the Wye River, and it's too shallow.
Shallow.
Yeah, the ships couldn't get up. So they let some troops out, which went around and burned some things. And that's what happened to Washington. But you can only sail up to the south side of DC. You can't get the big ships with the big guns up into there. And that's why they sailed to Fort McHenry to try to take out the fort, since they couldn't get the mills. And everybody knows that story. But that's all because we cheesed off the empire by supplying our superior quality wheat to the French. It was all about the mills. How much?
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
It looks like there's another question, Nevin. Well, two, one from Janelle and one from Donna in the chat.
Have I answered everything, spoken to everything previous? Sufficient. Okay. The Quakers were involved in shipping. How did piracy affect their trade? Or perhaps it didn't. Oh no, piracy affected everybody's trade, except people didn't try usually to piratize for profit with grain and timber They might try slaves, but I haven't even read of trying to rip off slaves. It wasn't worth it. They were going after mainly the Spanish ships, and just they would pick on the other countries. But remember the currents? The Spanish fleets from South and Central America and North America were coming up our coast in the current to get back to Europe. And that's who got piratized on an extremely high level. Why go for wheat when you can get gold?
Yeah.
Or silver, or jade? All right. So it wasn't as big a risk to regular merchant traders, unless somebody thought you had gold on board and then you had a problem. Yeah. Let's see. Do I teach any early American history courses at Chesapeake? I don't see enough. Well, at Chesapeake, we teach intro to everything. So we have US 1 and US 2 and World Civ 1 and World Civ 2. And so that's what we go with so far, although we're thinking about some 200 level courses that would be more like early America, colonial America, early national America, Civil War, things like that. But we work so much teaching what we already do that we haven't put that in the catalog, and I guess I've been thinking about that for the last 20 years. So I should fish or cut bait to be local about it. US 1 is going to cover a lot of this. I don't usually get to teach that because we have a US historian. I'm more of the World Civ Intro to Art, geography, social studies person.
Right.
Cynthia?
Well, I just wanted to, I'm fascinated with the whole topic of the indentures. And one of the things that I have read about that is really, really kind of incredible, when it was a contract, even though you have some, scruffy person off the streets of London, it was a legal contract. And most of what we know about the lives of these indentured people is when they could, because it was a legal contract, they could take the indenture holder to court. And so some of what we know, or most of what we know up here, comes from very, very old court records where people have taken their owners to court, and especially women, and won because the owner of the indenture was not adhering to the contract. It really is just fascinating to me. Even though they weren't fed anything, they could still take their owner to court.
Well, as that would hold as long as the judge wasn't your owner,
Right.
or wasn't too good of a friend. Salisbury and somebody asked in the chat about opportunities to study more. Salisbury University and Washington College both have extensive research in early America and even local history. So there are more opportunities.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I'm on the Western Shore up in Westminster.
Oh, well, let's see. There's some things over there. Quite a few things over there. See, I'm so old. I'm thinking Western Maryland College, but it's
McDaniel now. That's where I got my master's.
Oh, congratulations! Yeah, I wish I could.
It's great.
What was that, Barry? You froze up.
At this point, I would like, I'm gonna stop my video, see if that helps. I can, is that better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, much clearer.
Okay, great. At this point, we've kind of come to the end of our time frame. And so I would like to thank Professor Crouse so much for your very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. I also would love to thank all of you who participated, who came. To me, it's a historic occasion for Old Y Mill, the Maryland's oldest continuously operated business, dating most likely from 1682 to enter the 21st century with a Zoom-based virtual presentation on American history and specifically the history of our region. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity, and I'm grateful to all of you who joined us for this evening. I will remind you that we have 4 more events in this series. Professor Crouse referred to many of the, gave the foundation really of some of the issues that will be raised in next week's talk, the relationships and the social structure specifically of the gentry that we touched on tonight will be detailed by Sherry Marsh Johns. The following week, Steve Childers, who is with us, will be addressing one aspect of the artisan class. There he is. Thank you, Steve. In discussing inventions and engineering that transform the manufacture of flour from wheat and corn. And the following week, Tony Cohen, who is a historian of abolition and the Underground Railroad, will give us a great deal more information specifically about enslaved people on the Eastern Shore and how they made their way to freedom. And then the final talk by Kate Livy will be specifically addressing the issues of water power, water transportation, and how that was so critical to the development. I think she's going to address the Eastern Shore, but for those of you on the Western Shore, I think it pertains as well. So I hope that you will register for the remaining sessions. And again, John Nizer, our board president, mentioned that we are opening for the first time in over a year and a half on May 1st, and we're making that a very festive occasion. And I hope that you'll make your way to Old Y Mill between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. on that first Saturday in May and join us in person. So at this point, thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
If you are an active volunteer or prospective volunteer for Old Y Mill, would you just stick around for a few minutes and we can have a brief conversation just about that idea. Everyone else, good night, and I hope to see you next Thursday evening.
Very
you.
quick question before you go. There was a question in the chat
Sure.
about sharing a recording of the presentation. Will that be done over email?
I know we are recording it, and I believe I can send an email to everyone who was signed on tonight with a link to the recording. So I think the answer is yes there.
Well, thank you, Barry. It was nice to be asked.
It's been a pleasure. Okay. It's a little odd. I see two boxes for myself. I apologize for my connectivity issue. I don't know why. When I have my video on, it often freezes. But I am wondering if we still have a lot of people here. That is great. If there's anyone who has been a volunteer in whatever capacity, an interpreter at Old Wye Mill, who might reflect on something they heard in Nevin's presentation that we can use, that you think you might be able to work into your standard presentation as we're talking about the history of the mill, or something that you might feel, even though you might not actually share it with visitors, would still inform how you would express what you're saying about the mill's history. Do I have a volunteer? If not, I'm going to start at the top and see if we can have our board officers see if there's anything that comes to mind.
I'll start. Barry.
Oh, good. Ellen, fantastic.
I just took me a minute to get myself back into unmute and all that kind of stuff. But you say that our normal talk, but I'm going to tell you there isn't a normal talk because everybody comes with a different question. And it has absolutely floored me, the variety of questions that we get. So I love this kind of a talk because you get little pieces. And somebody will ask a question and you go, oh, yeah, I remember. I went up to see Ben Franklin, not Ben Franklin. Yeah, Franklin's house north of Philadelphia, the reconstruction of it. And no, I'm sorry, William Penn's house north of Philadelphia. And I learned up there that on his first voyage over, he carried with him all the things that he needed for the mill. And that just set off a light bulb for me. And so now I've worked it into my talk. Every once in a while, I'll tell people that seem particularly interested in history that's what happened with William Penn. And that's probably what happened. It was certainly the first thing everyone who started a colony had to do was build a mill, because that was basic to the food production. So I appreciate all the things that Nevin has said, because little pieces come in. That whole the Gulf Stream and bringing in of goods and sending out of raw materials. It works in. People will ask a question and a light bulb will go about, and I can picture it now because I've seen the picture and share that with people. I'm excited about that. I'm just curious how they found how long they knew about the Gulf Stream. Because did that come with discovering America? That's for
Nevin, can you
you, Nevin.
speak to that?
Yeah, that was discovered early on, before people were even admitting that there was anything over here, because apparently Basque fishermen got into the Gulf Stream off the coast, apparently accidentally at first, and ended up off the east coast of Canada, where there were more fish than anybody had ever contemplated before, and they would ride the currents around and around. But before that, even there's a legend that's apparently true. I mean, I don't know why you would say it if it wasn't, of a guy named Saint Brendan, an Irish monk, who got in a small boat to be close to God, and apparently got in the current, because like many years later, he came back to Ireland and said, there are these strange people, and there's this place we don't even know about over on the other side of the ocean. And everybody said, yeah. Well, there you go. Yeah. So there were rumors, and see, the Basque fishermen sold at Spanish and Portuguese ports. And so this Italian guy named Cristoforo Colombo was talking to some of them, and well, and there you go. Now, he apparently didn't get in the current right. He tried to go more directly and almost died. But you know that story. If he would have stuck in the current, like the fisherman
Sure do.
told him, he would have made it. Although the bass
You would have.
keep that
Uh-huh.
secret because they didn't want to share the fish.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
the story of fish in the North Atlantic is very, very interesting. And I will piggyback on what Nevin has said. As I'm usually recommending books, there's a book with a 3-letter name, Cod, that gives you a lot of the background of what Nevin has just spoken about, the Basque fishermen, the extent to which the fish from that northern bank around Newfoundland fed the people of Europe, because cod can be fairly easily dried and salted even on board the ships, and it was providing inexpensive protein for the people of Europe. So fishermen were charting that Gulf Stream very long ago, well before it was documented in writing or in maps anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Very
a very
interesting
good question.
The fishermen and the explorers were 100 years or more before the settlers.
Okay, that makes sense.
So by the time the settlers got here, two things. First of all those quirks of the Gulf Stream and the Sargasso Sea and all that were known. But second of all, the great dyings had taken place, probably the worst thing in human history, where millions of North Americans had died. And so when people stepped off in North America and British colonies, they said, behold, what a beautiful empty land God has prepared for us. And of course, if you think of millions of people dying in a plague, and yes, it was millions because they weren't hunting and gathering, they were mainly farming. So all the estimates for the population are based on hunting and gathering. And that's not what the Indians were doing. Anyway, it wasn't likely the Lord, it was likely the other guy that provided the empty land. But,
Yeah.
you know, just kind
He's
of.
still in charge.
I will back that up
Hey,
as
Nevin,
well with, go ahead, John.
Nevin, I just want to thank you for a very interesting part one. And thank you for leading us forward, and everybody else behind you will be picking up pieces from you. And I appreciate your time. And I see you as a future miller, since you have a family background.
There you go.
Well, I got to retire sometime.
I want to follow up what Nevin has said about the Native people by again recommending a book that I just found extraordinary called 1490, obviously the year before 1492. And it talks about what the enormous populations of Native people who lived in North, Central, and South America who were wiped out in plagues of diseases in vast numbers, and the complex, advanced cultures that some of them lived in large cities. It's a really good read. I forget the author, but 1491 is an easy title to remember.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
So I think my feeling is that what we have learned from Nevin's presentation can sometimes provide a sort of a frame around the mill, so that when we talk about individual millers, we can talk about them as being in that artisan class, being in a minority, a very small minority, because in our region, the vast majority of human beings were low-level, unskilled agricultural workers. Only a very small number of people had the kind of skill that it would have taken to carry out the task of milling. And with the new exhibit that's going up, we'll be able to demonstrate both in the colonial era, the pre-Oliver Evans era, just how much machinery, how much technology, because it is absolutely technology, and capital investment would have been necessary for a miller to reach that artisan status. It was so far beyond what even an advanced, let's say, indentured servant who had inherited, had been able to accumulate, let's say, a small amount of land or a reasonably comfortable farming lifestyle. And very few of them did reach that status at all. And yet the artisan, the miller, his status compared to the gentry, the landowner who owned hundreds of acres and enslaved dozens, if not hundreds of laborers, was very lowly. And so his status and ability to, let's say, negotiate with the landowner was very limited. You know, he was dependent upon the landowners for the raw material. So it's just, as we come to understand who these individual millers were, I think what Nevin has taught us tonight will enable us to see, to understand what their place was in their society and how they would have looked around and how they would have related to the other elements of society of that time.
I'm anxious.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm very happy to hear more because I don't know much. Like, I've only talked about very early, but we only had 45 minutes, you know. But the elite families all intermarried. And so the gentry class became socially self-perpetuating. And that's gotta be fascinating, but I don't know that much about it, other than, you know, what I just said.
Well,
Right.
Sherry
Well, fortunately,
Johns will-
Sherry Marchand
Yes,
does.
that's what she will be talking about.
So with that,
Before we end, can I ask everybody a question?
sure, go
Go
ahead,
ahead,
Steve.
Steve.
Yeah, is anybody aware of any record that tells us when the Oliver Evans system was installed at Y Mill?
Not that we have found yet.
Okay,
He lived in an area called Tuckahoe, which is now Tuckahoe State Park. And we know he moved there with his brother and they opened up a store, and his brothers in Delaware, Family Mill.
but don't give away too much of my talk.
Say what?
Don't give away too much of my talk now.
I'll shut up, Steve, right now. I'll mute myself.
We'll call that a teaser, a tiny preview of 2 weeks from tonight. So I think with all of these interesting connections to our future talk, we will wrap up for tonight. Again, I thank Nevin. I want to acknowledge our appreciation for Jim Casey and his long years of service to Old Y Mill and his enormous and really incalculable contribution. And so it's extremely appropriate that we dedicate the series to his memory. So I look forward to seeing all of you next Thursday night, if not before. Thank you all for participating.
Good night.
John.
Good night.
Thank you, Barry.
And Barry, thank you, Barry. Hey, Barry, can you thank the young
Thank you, Nevin.
that helped us? Oh, you're very welcome.
Oh, and Anastasia Rokiski, are you still here? I think she may have signed off, but I will be sure to convey our thanks, and we do expect her back next week.
Wonderful.
Okay, good night, everyone, then.
Good night.
Good night. Thank
Good
you all.